Hi everyone. Thank you for waiting for the
Oh,
obligatory 5 minutes delay in starting anything these days. I am gonna give it another second for a few stragglers to join from the waiting room, and hopefully more people will start trickling in as we progress. Um, Welcome, happy Saturday to everyone who's chosen to spend it with the Another Europe is Possible AGM for 2026. Um, what an incredible start of the year we've had so far. Politically, I think very much a good moment to come together, discuss, review, and plan and strategize, which is obviously the purpose of our AGM. At Another Europe is Possible, we're quite generous in that these discussions are not gate kept. We have invited all of our supporters to join the first part of the meeting. Um, and we will hear from two different sets of speakers and panelists. First, we're going to talk about Britain's fragmented political scene with Michael Chisholm, who I think needs very little introduction, but who used to lead Another Europe is Possible for a really long time, for its foundational years. And Graham Campbell, a friend of Another Europe is Possible, a member of the National Committee, and a stalwart of the political scene in Scotland. Graham is part of the socialist group within the SNP and a councillor in Glasgow. And Laura Parker will be facilitating this first session. Then we're going to have a 5 minute break and we're going to look into another topic, another issue that has been at the core of what Another Europe is Possible is about, and that is migration. At the end of last year, we released a report authored by Zoe William, Zoe Gardner, and Zoe and Seema Saida, who until recently was a member of staff for Another Europe is Possible. She's off to do great things at JCWI. They're going to discuss a little bit about the report, what brought it to being, what are some of the political implications of it, but also a wider context of what's happening with migration in Europe and more widely globally. What are the lessons that we can learn? What are the challenges that we share with others? And then I'm going to ask everyone who's not a member of Another Europe is Possible to leave, and we will have the session on our strategy. We're going to talk a little bit about the activities that we've been doing last year, and then what we plan to do together in 2026. As I was giving this introduction, I just clocked that 2026 is our anniversary year. It's 10 years of Another Europe is Possible. So happy birthday to all of us. Um, it really doesn't feel that long, but also, yeah, the white hairs, I think, speak to quite an intense decade that we've had together. So I'm going to hand over to Laura Parker for our first session with Michael and Graham, and I'll be looking at the chat if there are any questions or issues. Um, yeah, there will be Q&A with people from the audience. So feel free to put your questions in there. I'll monitor for that. And off we go.
hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Oh, hallelujah. Hi, everyone. I moved house yesterday, and this absolutely wonderful group of really lovely people took my and my husband's rubbish from one place to another. But somewhere along the line, the internet cable also disappeared. So I'm doing this on my phone, which is less than optimal. Um, I'm really pleased to see you all, and I think that the subject of our first discussion is really important. We're going to talk about the fragmentation of British politics. Now, obviously, we're an internationalist organisation, so I'm sure there'll also be reflections on what we're seeing beyond the UK. My first thought, in fact, this morning was that fragmentation, the words, I think carries a sort of sense of negativity. And I suppose one of my challenges to both Graham and Michael is that perhaps this isn't all a bad thing. In fact, perhaps it's not a bad thing at all. And far from seeing the fragmentation of British politics, what we're seeing is people finally just deciding that, well, the two major parties aren't doing it for me, so I am actually going to vote with heart and head. So we're not seeing so much a fragmentation as a realistic representation of the political desires of people across the UK. So I think it would be great to hear from both of you on how you're viewing this fragmentation. Just to give a bit more context, at the last general election, fewer people voted for the Labour Party or the Tory Party than at any time in the last 100 years. So the word unprecedented is bandied about a lot, but it genuinely was an unprecedented election. That trend has continued, and now those two parties combined are struggling to hit 40% in the polls. And it's pretty clear that across much of the country, we now have a five-party system. And of course, in Scotland, and I'm really delighted that we've got Graham with us today to talk about Scotland, there's the SNP and Plaid. So in fact, in some parts of the country, it's a seven-party race. The Economist, that radical journal, recently described the UK's voting system as slot machine politics. And as we head towards what I think everyone recognises could be a really critical by-election on the 26th of February in Gorton and Denton, it's actually not that clear what is going to happen. This is all against the backdrop of surveys which recently found that only 12% of people have trust in political parties putting the country first, which is a record low. And a tardy but nevertheless significant recognition within our own parliament that this system is bust and needs changing. So the all-party parliamentary group for fair elections, which campaigns against disinformation and dark money, and the bit I'm most engaged with for proportional representation, is the largest APPG in Parliament. So a lot of people know the system is bust and needs fixing. And I think probably many of you would argue that in terms of systems change, the response to this must be proportional representation. But what I would really like Michael, but first Graham, to talk about is the politics of this. Like, why are we where we are? How do you see this? Is fragmentation a great opportunity? Is it a big threat? Your perspectives on where you are geographically, but also your wider thinking would be really, really great. And then we're just going to see where the conversation takes us. And I think if he's there, yeah, Graham, I'm going to hand over to you now for about 4 or 5 minutes of introductory comments, then Michael, and then we'll have a chat.
Thank you, Laura. And apologies that you are having some background 80s music, but we are on a street stall for Springburn Only Love, Not Hate, which is the anti-racism group. We have to form 10 years after that Brexit vote that we had. And obviously that pivotal moment in the UK's politics has basically meant that we're now having to do anti-racism campaigning at a very grassroots level. So here we are taking proactive action to mitigate the threat of racists and fascists in our community dividing us more than we need to be. I thought I'd sort of begin by trying to sort of answer some of the questions for yes. The title of our presentation apparently said, "What are the opportunists and dangers within the situation?" I think meant opportunities and possibilities in the situation that we live in. But I suppose both are true. It's both, the people are trying to opportunistically avoid scrutiny of the way that the rich and powerful behave, and we only need to mention Andrew Mountbatten Windsor and Peter Mandelson to know that. But we are in a country that's fragmenting. The politics are fragmenting. but the state is fragmenting because it can no longer solve the issues at hand. You know, the democracy, the lack of respect for ruling of law, frankly, the corruption of the elite, the way that the multinational capitalists are organizing things, and of course their scapegoating of people like Jim Ratcliffe and so on. So we've got all of these things in our mix of politics, and yet within that, the elections that we have on May the 7th are undoubtedly going to lead to a change of leadership at the top of the Labour Party. I think it will be untenable for Starmer to lose elections in Wales, and with Labour becoming in third or even fourth place in the elections in Wales and in Scotland on May the 7th, with for the first time a Plaid Cymru government taking power in Wales, and obviously, from my point of view, an SNP government being re-elected here in Edinburgh for a unprecedented fifth term. You know, so we are in uncharted waters in terms of our politics. But obviously, from a European perspective, we spent a lot of years together campaigning on, first of all, as the left against Brexit. You know, but the anti-Brexit vote for us in Scotland has always been linked with the national question and the question of political independence. Getting back into Europe is now obviously has been mainstream for the majority of Scots, 2/3 of whom voted to stay in the European Union. And the only way that we have to get back that we can see in the short term is to get independence for our country. But that's now coming at the same time as that Welsh vote could also lead to a pro-European internationalist Democratic Socialist Party taking power there. So you'll have potentially on May the 7th governments in 3 of the 4 devolved nations which are pro-independence or unity for Ireland, for example. Then you've got the pressure on England. The obvious points about Andy Burnham, I'm sure you'll discuss this at great length, but the very fact that the Labour leadership is prepared to block Andy Burnham and probably almost guarantee that it loses the Gorton and Denton by-election indicates just how craven the people who run the Labour Party unfortunately are now to the interests of big capital and the elites that they are bought and paid for to speak for. Unfortunately, the need for massive democratic reform of Westminster and the devolution of real power to regions and cities like Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool, and indeed the conflict with London. London obviously is a very big international place, and they want to be part of Europe as much as Glasgow does. You know, only if there is a devolved settlement within England that changes things. And I think there could be an impetus after May the 7th, when Labour will unfortunately lose both of those elections and all the local governments. I think that could help us push for a proper democratic settlement at Westminster, the reform agenda, getting rid of the unelected lords, you know, all of that stuff, which is supposed to be part of the agenda of the UK government, that now has to come back into play. If the lesson they learn from all those defeats that they deservedly will get is that they don't change, then they're help opening the door to reform and fascism. Now, frankly, us in Scotland, we aren't prepared to wait for 3 years for the chance to vote out and vote against Nigel Farage getting into government in 2029. We have elections this year. We will demand a referendum, as we rightly should do, because we've had that mandate for 10 years. We don't want it to be blocked further and further and further. We are arguing for an SNP majority so that it's absolutely no doubt that that's what the public's voting for. With independents polling 50-50, and a large part of the reason why it's polling so highly is because people want back in Europe. They want back in there. Now, of course, there have been some concessions around that. We've got a partial return to Erasmus, and some of the young people's access to that market's there. But we want, the trade effect that it's had on Scotland alone, on exports. It's had a minus effect on exports over the 10 years. Most of the very people who voted for Brexit have been the most badly affected by it in terms of trade, jobs, and investment. It's only going back in that makes it possible for us to fully recover from the recession we've been experiencing for the last 10 years. So I'm setting that background. That I think that for you pro-European campaigners, it's unavoidable that you have to deal with the national question and support Scotland and Wales's right to a referendum on self-determination as part of the mix of the discussion about how we return to Europe. That's me.
That's brilliant, thank you. And I didn't get the 80s music. I'm a bit disappointed because that's definitely my era. But, so there's quite a bit of optimism, I think, from you, Graham, in a way. Like your analysis is pretty damning, and I'm sure shared by most of us. But it sounds like in the end you land on there's a potential opportunity here, if only the I think, did you describe them as craven idiots who run the Labour Party um, will wake up to it. Um, Michael, can I see you? Where are you? I
Hello,
don't know
hello.
if you're feeling optimistic. Hi.
Ooh, am
So,
I feeling?
what's your take on where we are?
Well, um, yeah. So, I suppose, hello to everyone. It's lovely to see so many people again. It's been a while. I haven't come to another Europe thing in a bit. Um, I suppose that the first thing to say is that really what this moment is a camp is a moment where I think for a long time what the Brexit moment consisted of, and to an extent what kind of the big elections in the US consisted of for a while, it was that there was this plausible moment where you could have had us defeating the insurgent far right by, in some senses, working with the existing centre left, and in some senses working with that kind of that kind of like old, to an extent, establishment, but like peeling off a bit of the political establishment that you can actually work with, and that the centre, in some senses, might sort of hold. That we would drag it leftwards, we would form our own left blocs, we would change politics, but that fundamentally, like the centre wasn't going to collapse to such an extent that we thought it was, say, in the kind of mid 2010s when it looked like, it was totally collapsing. I think the moment we're living through now is where, and this is what the Trump election did for me, was like absolutely the center is completely gone. The old establishment center left is sunk, and both morally and electorally bankrupt. And there is nothing standing between us, the progressive left, and the far right. We are going to have to do this ourselves. And to the extent that we're working with the existing centre left, we're going to have to be the leading force in that. Um, in a way, if you think about what the anti-Brexit coalition really represented, um, that was we were always a kind of critical left-wing part of that anti-Brexit coalition, but really that I think that the moment for that coalition is now over. They can't deliver anything. Um, um, and the other thing I would observe is that if you spend a lot of time around the left, as I do, you will often come up with people about talking about like defeating the far right. And again, but very often it sounds like, you know, you're going to reel out strategies for defeating the far right that were the strategies for defeating the far right in like when it was the National Front, or like the way we're going to defeat the far right is by mobilizing people on the streets and so on. And we absolutely do need to mobilize people on the streets, but we do have to reckon with the fact that the fundamental challenge that we face at the moment, in this sharp moment that we're in, is an electoral one. The far right is an electoral vehicle led by Nigel Farage, and it's on course for power. And it's on course for power in a constitution that would give it a lot of power. Um, so in a way, it's kind of like there's some good synergy there, because just as this moment calls for an electoral alternative of the left, we are getting an electoral alternative of the left. That is happening very much outside the Labour Party because of the contradictory legacies of Corbynism. On the one hand, Corbynism created a mass expectation, a mass appetite amongst millions of people to be represented in politics. If you grew up in the era that I grew up in, I was born in '89. I grew up in the noughties and the '90s, but if you grew up in that era, you will have grown up in an era when kind of the left simply was not featured at all. Corbynism changed all of that, and it created people are not going to go back to not having any political representation in the mainstream. And at the same time, that big force, that big kind of angry well of force, muted. created through the asset economy, the austerity crisis, the cost of living crisis, is never going to find expression through the Labour Party because, well, at least in this moment, is not going to find expression through the Labour Party because the other legacy of the Corbyn moment was that the people who run the Labour Party were absolutely determined to ensure that we could never do that ever again, and have completely shut that down. And so, what that equation equals is a big electoral alternative outside the Labour Party. That is obviously happening primarily in the Green Party in England, and to an extent in England and Wales as well, and also to an extent in Scotland, but things are obviously different in different bits of the UK. And that's where I've ended up as well. And I'll talk about that in a minute. I think it's also worth remarking that these big kind of pushes of support, both on the radical left and on the far right, are kind of big political developments and big kind of moments of political independence of those forces, are not coincidental. Like it's and I think this is something that certainly the radical left, especially the Corbynite left, failed to reckon with during the Brexit moment. Um, when the centre collapses, um, um, on the one hand, we created lots of nice alternatives in Syriza and Podemos and Corbynism and so on. I think what Corbynism failed to reckon with was the fact that the right and the right and the large sections of the ruling class were preparing their own shock. Um, and in a way, we were trained fighting centrism when actually we needed to. The force that we ended up actually going up against was the Brexit project. And we're very much in that moment now. I mean, we're about to fight we're about to fight sets of elections that are basically running up directly against the political um, the political successes of the Brexit project. Um, and I don't think that, in a way, the radical left, to a great extent, still hasn't reckoned with what happened during Brexit and what those politics represent. And I think there's been very little reflection on the Brexit moment on the left, both within people who are on our side of the debate and people who are on the other side. And I suppose I wonder that kind of silence on this enormous moment that happened. I hope that this year, at the 10th anniversary of the referendum, we might tread over some of that stuff in a kind of useful way, rather than in a who was to blame for the 2019 election, which is a conversation of which I am deeply bored. Um, um, the so Sorry, I don't know how much longer you want me to talk for. I could talk for a couple of
You, you could probably go on for another hour, and I would be very
yeah.
happy to listen to you. But if I give you another minute, will that be okay?
Okay, sure. Um, So very quickly then on the Green Party, there's obviously a massive surge happening. What we do when we end up in local government, I'm currently running for council in Brixton, and it is very possible that we will end up taking Lambeth Council. So I think there are all sorts of problems in terms of where we end up, and what we do, what the hell we do if we take over local government. Don't have time to go into that. Um, we spoke about, like, is fragmentation a good or a bad thing? I don't think it is. I think actually, in a way, if I could go back in time, I would much rather that we could not do it all again inside the Labour Party, but we could, but that actually, my politics very much is still the people with the power to change things are the organised working class, and we do all want to end up in some kind of single vehicle, multi-tendency big vehicle. Um, and I would much rather that we weren't split between the Labour Party and your party and the Green Party. But as I was trying to explain to people in the Labour left when I left, we don't get to choose the terrain that we're fighting on. Like we don't get to just decide that the Labour Party strategy is going to work. We have to react to what's going around us. Um, and so I won't go into that too much. Um, I would finally say that, like, my big worry about the moment I talked about the electoral politics being central. My big worry is quick fix politics. And I think for as long as the left has been back on the ascendancy, that, I mean, like, we are full of holy grails. We are fully like there. Some people are obsessed with sortition. Some people are obsessed with PR. I'm very much in favor of PR. Some people are obsessed with all sorts of other stuff, right? And electoral politics, really what's happening is a series of quick fix projects. You know, that we need to kind of flip over and overturn the last the decades of defeat that we've had by winning this election with this new electoral vehicle. And I suppose under all of it, I think we need to worry about what are we doing to the deep strength, the deep social coalitions, the deep organizing strength of the left, the working class, and the oppressed. And um, um, that's not to say that we abandon the electoral sphere and say, oh no, let's not bother with that. Let's do something else, or let's run this kind of like ultra left thing that doesn't really mean anything electorally. I'm not saying that. I'm a Green Party council candidate, but I worry sometimes that we are like moths drawn to bright flames, and that we have been ever since Corbynism happened. And I'll just leave that hanging there.
Provoking as usual. Graham, do you have any response to Michael? And in particular, it seems to me you've both concluded, I mean, you, Graham, I think have always been there, but the rehabilitation of Labour as a short, medium, or potentially even long-term challenge isn't that's not where the fight should be. So that's clear, Graham, from your own politics in the Scottish context. But when you think about things beyond Scotland, would you share Michael's assessment that actually the fight just has to be elsewhere now?
It's predominantly elsewhere, yes, but that doesn't mean I don't think it's important for pro-European Labour activists to try and assert their counter narrative to the nonsense that's ahead. Because the Centre Starmer's government has been about, placating reform voting or Tory-minded Brexiteers to vote for Labour by not promising to rejoin. That obviously is completely collapsed from scratch because it's not going to work. So then, how does Labour activists as a pro-European political force assert that pro-European agenda? And they will have to be forced to do so from the outside. So obviously, some of that pressure will come from the Greens in England and Wales, from Plaid and from the SNP having the platforms that they will have to argue for a return to at least the customs union and the common market and freedom of movement. So all of these things, and of course a border poll in the north of Ireland. That now comes into play as well. So I think it makes sense. I mean, I think that our grouping should argue for a special referendum day. One, to reverse Brexit. Two, to allow independence referendums for the nations and a border poll. But also a realignment of the democracy in England itself, so that there's proper regionalised devolution and an abolition of the House of Lords. I think there are people in the Labour Party who agree with that perspective and who've argued for it and who are on this call. I think that would be a really important thing as a democratic demand to raise within the campaign. As I say, I do think it's outside the Labour Party, but it's also got to be reflected inside there as well.
Yeah, I mean, my own personal perspective is that I agree with that. I haven't done a full Michael, but I did I did leave Labour, but I hope, I mean, I have to remain optimistic that if they get the drubbing that they will rightly deserve in this by-election, there is a moment of recognition that they could still just about pull things back if they were willing to be bolder on a democratic reform agenda, which is, of course, the great tragedy will be overstating the fact that Andy Burnham's not going to be an MP. But I think the great regret about Burnham's candidacy for me is not what he would bring to a whole range of sort of domestic policy issues necessarily, and his international positions, I don't know what some of them are, but he definitely has a very clear idea about democratic reform. And I think that could have been really important. And then all the points that you've just made, Graham, about the relationship with the EU, which I think, by the way, we're going to come back to towards the end of the day when we think more about our European strategy. Michael, happy to have you respond if you want to. And then I think we're going to see some questions.
Yeah, I mean,
Are you
I
there,
think
Stuart?
I would just say, yeah, look, I don't want to do down the Labour left. There's obviously, like, in a way, what we need is coalition, don't we? Like, are any of the electoral vehicles in England capable of taking on reform on their own? Like the Labour Party's current, like you can't have the Labour Party as an alternative to reform when it is running with an immigration policy like well to the right of where UKIP was a few years ago. Um, so at the moment, I just can't. You can't include the Labour Party as part of that coalition under its current leadership, and that's the problem. You can't really do deals with that vehicle. Um, you can. I mean, I'm certainly, locally, for instance, we have a fantastic local Labour MP, Bel Rabiru Adi, who's the MP for the constituency that I'm running for ward in. She's my local MP. So I would say, like, yes, let's stand down for her. I would definitely like favour some sense of alliances there. But at the moment, none of those vehicles are tenable. I don't think the Green Party is on its own going to take a nationwide fight to reform and defeat reform on its own. I certainly don't think that your party is. So really, what we need is an electoral alliance between these three forces. Um, the crucial part of that is installing Andy Burnham or a figure like him very soon, because the problem is going to come. So at the moment, under its current leadership, firstly, Labour won't talk to us, but secondly, like we can't really do deals with Labour at the moment. Like, it's not morally tenable. Um, but also but the further down we get, once you get towards 2027, 2028, a lot of Green Party candidates are going to be in place already. We will probably already be well up the polls, and the willingness within both parties to do that deal is going to be very limited. So really, to make that kind of like three-way alliance tenable, you need a change in the Labour leadership. You need it now, and I think it does have to be Andy Burnham, because I think he is going to be the most open-minded on democratic questions and therefore on alliances. So I think the time is ticking on that.
Yeah, I just a small plea. I mean, I'm not one, but I think we shouldn't forget in here the Liberal Democrats, certainly in terms of how electoral stuff plays out in the UK. And I think if you listen to someone like Layla Moran, um, as a general rule, she's got a better position on most things than the vast majority of the people that we hear from in the Labour Party. But I think you're right, Michael, that the maths just at the moment, even if every sort of more radical Lib Dem, the bits we can bear of Labour, all the Greens we can manage, SNP implied, they're still up against it in the world in which the Tories do some sort of deal with reform, which we must never discount because they will sell their own grannies if they need to. I'm going to go to Seema and then Jim, just because I can see you with your hands up. And then I'm going to ask Elena if there's any comments, questions in the chat. Seema, nice to see you.
Nice to see you all too, and thanks so much for that great introduction, especially starting off setting the scene with the big political scandals of the day, Epstein, Andrew, and how that shows that the system is really like on its knees and crumbling. And I think I'm quite interested in trying to understand as well, given that we've kind of seen how implicated elements of the state are in this corrupt billionaire elite running paedophile rings and trying to control serious elements of our politics, which in the past, if you had raised, you would be called a conspiracy theorist. But it turns out these conspiracies are true, and we kind of have to face that reality. Um, I think electoral solutions are obviously key and important, but at the same time, how are we actually building a strategy to investigate, challenge, and dismantle those corrupt elements of the state that enable a billionaire ruling elite to manipulate politics and democracy in the way that they have? And for me, like all the revelations I'm seeing coming in, day out, including things like Gordon Brown's resignation, which was pushed uh, the files show that elements of it were pushed, by some of these corrupt billionaires. How do we reckon with that side of things? Because it's not enough just to win elections. We also have to challenge the power of the state. And from the Stop Trump perspective, looking at what's happened now that Trump is in power, and the way he's using ICE and the way he's flagrantly just avoiding any democratic accountability, how do we build an alternative kind of power that's able to resist that materially on the ground as well? So I'm talking like anti-raids groups. I'm talking about, when the violence of the state tries to crush an insurgent left, if and when a Green minister could win, and tries to do something radical like challenge the power of these financiers, is simply winning an election enough, or how do we have a strategy kind of outside of that as well? That's my question. Thanks.
That's a brilliant question. I'm going to take Jim's comment and then go to Graham and then Michael for a quick response.
Luke, I think you put your hand up just before I. So do you want to go first?
No, it's okay. I'm happy to wait.
Okay. Well, I'll be very quick. I just wanted to say three things. The first thing has to do with the alliance that you were talking about, Michael. Yeah, and I'm just wondering about the practicalities of how this is realised. Are we talking about sort of stand-down arrangements between the parties concerned? If that's what we have in mind, I'm a little bit. What's the term I'm looking for? I'm just wondering how realistic it is. I mean, I just think that local activists working for the Labour Party, the Lib Dems, and so on, will they be willing to stand aside for each other, or are we better off thinking in terms of tactical voting and how we can unite ourselves to defeat reform in that way, rather than the stand-down arrangements, which I suspect are a little bit unfeasible. However, that's my first question. Second is that I was struck by the fact, Michael, that you use the terms radical left, progressive left, and centre left, which I think is interesting because for me it raises the question about, okay, what does it mean to be on the left in in the early 21st century? And I think my answer would be that to be on the left is to realize that in a globalized world, it is impossible to think of taking forward any genuinely left-wing project in the absence of the realization that we need further European integration and therefore the sort of regulatory, to put it out, I suppose, the sort of regulatory clout that we need in order to be able to take on the the tech giants and so on and so forth. So in other words, to be on the left is you can't separate it from a project of further European integration and sort of nationalism generally, I suppose. Then the third question I have was for Laura, I suppose, and that is, Laura, proportional. I'm not sure where I stand, to be honest, on proportional representation. I mean, I get the arguments for it. What worries me about it is that it will put a considerable amount of power in the hands of party leaders, make it difficult for the individual citizen to know who to direct their query to, when they have a query that requires the intervention of a member of parliament. I mean, if you have large multi-members of constituencies, who do you actually go to? And then the third worry I have is that it might actually favour groups like Reform in the sense that, to a certain degree, it kind of relieves them of responsibility for policies that don't work out well. Because, of course, when you're in a coalition government and things don't work out, you can always say, well, it's not our fault. It has to do with our coalition partners. If you are a single party with an overall majority, it's difficult to escape accountability in that sense. Yes, so I guess for me there's a sort of accountability issue involved as well. Anyway, sorry, I've gone on long enough. Thanks very much.
That was a very elegant cheat, getting 3 questions there for the price of 1.
Thank you.
I couldn't see your hand, Luke, because you're on the top left-hand screen of my phone, and your hand is obscured by the record button. So do you want to chip in Then
Yeah,
we'll get
sure.
reactions, and then we'll go to Elena.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for great conversation kicking off the discussions. So yeah, a couple of points. I put a link to it in the chat. I agree with what Seema was saying about this current crisis of the global establishment and their corruption. I think more specifically, it's potential has the potential to be an expenses scandal type crisis for the Labour right. If you're old like me and you can remember that reference, I think that Josh Simmons story in The Guardian would definitely be front page news. I mean, it can do encourage everyone to read it because it contains stunning details about passing alleged evidence, but not evidence at all to GCHQ and stuff like this on journalists that were investigating Labour together. So really shocking, appalling stuff. Um, I think this then links to this question that's already been discussed around whether what's the state of play with Labour. I mean, personally, I'm still in it, but I wouldn't say, well, I've never been particularly sectarian about Labour Party membership anyway, and always been a pluralist. So I wouldn't say I'm a particularly strong supporter of staying in, and I agree with pretty much everything I think that Graham and Michael have said. There's still, I would just say, quite a lot of institutional power present in the Labour Party. Don Flynn mentions in the chat the trade union link that I think is really important. There's ructions at the moment in Unite about how much it's going to be giving to the party. And I think that represents a source of working class political representation that's still important. And also just all of our friends and colleagues in Parliament and those that aren't our friends in terms of the broader backbenches. I mean, this cabinet now is so unbelievably narrow. I was looking at it the other day, and I mean, it really is 95% are hardcore Labour right, Blairite. So I think there will be ructions and opportunities ahead that hopefully will provide a bit of opportunity for those to use, opposition within the Labour Party to challenge this government. And the last thing I was going to say is that the effect of the rise of the Greens on another Europe is possible and the related crisis in your party, I think, does change some of the atmosphere on the left around the Brexit question. I think because Polanski is so pugnacious and clear in his attack on Brexit as a project, it really sort of diminishes that kind of sectarian attack on another Europe is possible as being a sort of fifth column for the British establishment and corruption and brought down Corbyn and stuff like that, and the complete mess that Corbyn has made of his party project, I think creates space for our kind of politics. I wondered, just to finish with a question to Michael. I mean, how do you see things going inside the Green Party? I mean, it might have some challenges ahead in terms of some of the crankier elements of the Corbyn project that don't like you, Michael, to put it bluntly. They're now members of the Greens. I've seen online in some cases, and there were some pretty tasty resolutions coming up at Green Party conferences. And I would be interested to hear how you see that going and how Green Party politics will be able to sort of handle that challenge.
Right, there was a lot in there. So I'm going to suggest Michael responds to the very direct question from Luke to him. I think it would be interesting also to hear your view, Michael, and Graham, perhaps you managed to be both for the state and for the same position we were in with the whole Brexit discussion, where we're wanting to argue as a matter of principle for remaining in the EU whilst arguing for its reform. And we're up against the Labour right, and obviously the Tories who will happily just get rid of most of the state. And how do we navigate that? But let's start with you, Michael, on and then I'll give you 2 seconds on PR. Let's start with you, Michael, though, on this question from Luke.
Yeah, so I think the internal politics of the Green Party are going to be really what we're witnessing now is the refounding of the Green Party. I mean, the Green Party had, it's tripled in membership in less than a year. It's a completely unrecognizable political force, and I do think that all of the old kind of critiques of the Green Party are kind of a bit redundant in a sense. Like anything that the Green Party did or was before last summer, well, it's probably something else now. The people who are animating this party are this massive kind of they're essentially the same social coalition that animated Corbynism. And so that is what we're dealing with in the Green Party, and that comes with lots of pros. And as Luke says, there are lots of cons there too. I think it's true to say that your party has probably soaked up some of the worst bits of that, and has done us a favor in that sense. Um, but yeah, there's a lot of stuff that's I won't go into the details of some of the motions, but yeah, like there's a lot of I would say quite I don't know. I am an anti-Zionist, but like I don't know. There's a particular brand of anti-Zionism that is being taken into the Green Party at the moment, which I think is a bit like yikes in parts. I also think that there's a whole there's certainly kind of the lexic round that they're going to come into the Green Party as well. Um, and yeah, I think that there's a certain level of kind of unpleasantness and nastiness and sectarianism that is going to get injected into the Green Party, and all of that will get worse as we get closer to power. And the thing about the Green Party, though, is that it's very democratic. And I suppose my big worry is that the Green Party overreacts to this influx by shutting down some of its democracy. It's very common um, to hear in Green Party meetings, "Oh, we're a bit too democratic," and I think that's very. I'm actually quite worried about that tendency and about the tendency, often from some perfectly good people who basically realise that we spend, our meetings go on for hours and hours and hours. We vote on absolutely everything, and actually, I'm quite in favour of that. We need our democracy in our conference, for instance, is any party member is entitled to attend conference. We don't even have a delegate system. And what that means is that you've got this party that's kind of anyone can submit a motion or an amendment on their own. It's a party's constitution that was designed for a small party of enthusiasts that is now a mass party of the left. And that obviously needs reform democratically, logistically and democratically. But what we need to make sure is that that democratic core isn't closed down. And I think there is a danger as we go into this, as people, as the Green Party leadership sees lots of things being kind of being brought in from the outside that it tries to close that down. I'd be very worried about that. I don't think that's something that Zach wants to do, but I think you could see it happening. And the other thing to say, and this is partly reaction to SEMA, is that the um, is about the state and about the relationship to the state and about what the state does to your party once you get into power and near power. And obviously, the reason why, I would have Ralph Miliband's critique of Labourism is not fundamentally about the Labour Party as well. It is, but it's about the Labour Party's proximity to the state. It's about what the state does to you. And I don't think that the Green Party has ever really properly reckoned with that. And so I think that we are very, very underprepared, I would say, in terms of our internal discussion about that, and about how to cope with that, and about how to hold our elected representatives in line, and so on. Um, Finally, on Jim's point, sorry if I'm banging on a bit here, but I just wanted to cover the bases if that's a good idea. Yeah, yeah. Very short. Jim's
Yeah.
point, you said like, what does it mean to be on the left? I actually think that the crucial thing to understand about being on the left in the 21st century is still the 2008 financial crisis, and it's still the collapse of political legitimacy of the old neoliberal order. I think that we are still living in the aftershocks of the 2008 financial crisis. I think the radical left when I say use three terms, I use the term radical left, centre left, and progressive left. I think the radical left are the people who recognise that we need a sharp anti-establishment alternative to neoliberalism. It's actually not necessarily a project of socialist transformation. That's my politics, but it's not necessarily what everybody on the radical left is doing. To an extent, actually, what they are is radical social democrats. The centre left is a group that is essentially split between those who recognise that old order needs replacing, and a group who are absolutely shackled to it and complicit with it. And the shackled to it and complicit bit of the centre left is the dominant strain, unfortunately, for all of us. And then the progressive left are the people who recognise, as you put it, that our route through all of this involves going forwards and not backwards, through international integration, through internationalism, and through politics that's kind of totally uncompromising on migrants' rights and anti-oppression politics. And those three circles overlap in various parts, but they're not all the same. And so to go return to Luke's point at the beginning, we're getting a lot of radical left influx into the Green Party at the moment. That's good, but not all of that radical left influx is the progressive left, as I would call it. And I think that that's a worthwhile distinction to make.
I feel there's another Chesham book coming on here.
That means I spoke too long, doesn't it?
No, it means that you're going to have a lot to say about the Green Party, having dissected the Labour Party. So I'm going to give the final word to Graham to pick up on whatever points you would like, and I will refer the answer from Graham Martin on PR in the chat, which looked to me to be pretty solid. Graham. Oh, Graham, you there?
To pack and unpack that I can't possibly do it. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Cool. Can you hear me?
Go ahead, Graham. We can hear you.
Right. Okay. So I can't possibly answer all of that, but let's have a go. Just on the trade union point that Don Flynn mentioned in the chat, clearly there's a pressure for the trade unions to affiliate to someone or something else. Your party's done such a good job of destroying itself that it probably is not capable of attracting those trade union affiliates on a national level, maybe locally. I have to say that as well, I agree with Michael's characterization of where to place what is radical left and what is progressive left. I would place Plaid Cymru and SNP on that scale in the progressive left, but with radical leftists like myself in those parties. Obviously, there's some people to the right of that, and some of them are still wedded to that mainstream social democratic understanding of the neoliberal period that we've been talking about since 2008. But I do think that, if you listen to Mark Carney's speech at Davos, and I think he recognized, so if the elite are recognizing that the neoliberal period is over, that the existing world order is already over, the question is what is replacing it, and what role does Europe play in replacing it? Because obviously we are in I'm a pro-European despite the European Union, not because of it, and I think that's probably true for a lot of people in this call. That if Scotland was to be an independent country in it, I would want it radically to be changed so that it properly the social Europe returns back, that community wealth building, which we passed in our parliament, comes mainstream across Europe, and actually regulation of capital flows and of capitalists comes right back, and the role of the state comes right back. So these are all questions for us, because the other thing is around the democracy questions. The disdain for democracy and the people who have been running the state is coming from the way they've behaved in office, from all the various corruptions we've had since 2008, with the financial crisis, the failure to tackle the bankers, then the Brexit crisis, and then the COVID crisis. We've had three consecutive crises, all of which, much of which have been self-inflicted by the morons that have been running our governments. So people have been disenchanted with the effect of democracy, because you vote for something and you can't get it. You vote for change, you don't get it. So people, of course, are going to an alternative that looks properly like an alternative. So the Greens are offering that in England and potentially in Wales. Plaid are offering that in Wales, and I hope the SNP to some extent is happening doing that in Scotland. Now, for the far left, I'm not of the view that the far left all need to be in the same party. I think, frankly, I don't have that much in common with the people responsible for Lexit, because they have a cardinal political error and responsibility for the role they played in bringing that about, in throwing migrant workers and the minority communities in this country under the bus at the time. And we have to call them out for that, because it fits with the Kremlinology that they have about how they understand the world, that they will be anti-American imperialism, anti-European imperialism, quite rightly so, but they just give an alibi to Russian imperialism and Chinese imperialism and ignore that. It's the consistent anti-imperialists that I see that we're in the camp of here, and that those consistent anti-imperialist radicals are spread in a lot of different places. And I don't think it's necessary for them all to be in one place. What they have to do is coordinate, though. There is a need for an anti-fascist coordination based on progressive principles, and to that extent, Paul Mason is a little bit right, because of course he's gone far to the right since then. But the core thing he argued about was that we needed to have an understanding of the threat of fascism in our age, and therefore what we are doing and what we're trying to do with the work we're in this AGM and later on is chart a way to stop fascism coming to Britain, because it is possible to happen. There are authoritarians there who are waiting in the wings. They are getting advantage of the dysfunction of the political and economic system. We have to have solutions that look like solutions to those problems that people can see and that affect their daily lives. And that, if we're successful in putting our solutions, and I hope that Hannah Spencer wins that by-election on Thursday, because that will be a big bulwark against the rise of Farage and his party. So the progressive left in the electorate is working out that it needs to come together, and I think the progressive left activists need to do the same.
That is a brilliantly optimistic note on which to finish. And I guess you've responded to the question about the fragmentation of British politics by saying, however fragmented it may be in general, we on the left cannot afford to be. And I think that is probably, that probably is the most important thing for us to take away from this discussion. Thank you both so much. I know we could all listen to you for a lot longer. Thanks, Graham, for multitasking. Sorry to people who didn't get questions answered, but we might do some mopping up via the chat. Sorry, my internet is wobbly. And I'm going to hand you back to Elena.
Yeah, that was really a fascinating conversation. And as Laura said, we could have this for hours. And in fact, one way to ensure that that happens, if you're interested, after today, we're going to get in touch with members about the National Committee elections that are coming up. So one way to keep those conversations going and for you to participate fully is to be a member, stand for the National Committee, become part of the National Committee, and then meet with Graham and meet with Michael and with Laura and Luke and whoever else gets elected on a regular basis and thrash these issues out. I'm going to give everyone a 3-minute break to just get a glass of water or whatever it may be, and then we're going to go into our next session. Our next session is on migration, and it's prompted by the release of our report, Time for Change, how the UK is getting it wrong on immigration, and what are some practical steps to address that. So we will talk about the report, but we'll also use it as a springboard to talk about broader issues across Europe and the world around migration. And Zoe is joining us, the author of the report, and also we'll chat with Seema about it. So yeah, come back in 2 minutes and we'll launch into that conversation. Was that 3 minutes? I'm not sure, but it's 12:35. So I'm calling us back. Um, as a reminder, we are recording this, so obviously people can choose whether to keep their cameras on or off. But it's been really nice to actually see you, especially because there's loads of familiar faces here, and it's lovely to see that we keep coming back for these discussions and these conversations. And I guess one issue that we keep coming back to as a campaign very much so is migrants' rights. We don't, and we never have seen migration as a problem to be solved, and migrants are not just a resource to fill in our employment gaps or to solve our economic woes. That is not the perspective of Another Europe is Possible and never has been. Indeed, the protection of freedom of movement and the expansion of freedom of movement were foundational goals for the campaign when it set out to defeat Brexit and the politics of Brexit. So in many ways, it feels interesting, let's say, that this report that Zoe Gardner authored for us, published together with Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, comes out now, well, at the end of 2025, after the UK government, a Labour government, with a massive landslide and huge numbers in Parliament, has launched its white paper, its plans for immigration, that in many ways I think would shame the Tories of 5, 10 years ago in terms of what they contain, the principles behind them. So it seems like a really good time to talk about practical alternatives, what could be different. And practical doesn't mean that it's necessarily politically very easy, but it's absolutely necessary at this point in time to look at what an alternative could be. And I suppose today also we'll try and discuss where we can look for lessons and examples, like how can we sell this to the current government, but also how can we make sure that, given in mind everything we discussed about the fragmentation of politics, that migration and policies around dignity and rights remain central to our movements. And so I'm gonna have this conversation with Zoe Gardner and Seema Saida, and we're gonna start with me just asking Zoe very briefly to kind of introduce the report, but also I think to say, why do you think now is a good time for this to come out?
Hi, Elena. Thank you so much. And great to see everybody. Yeah, so this report was, as you say, it was published towards the end of last year. And it was written in a context where the Labour Party was writing up these policy changes and proposals based on their white paper, which was so overwhelmingly hostile towards migrants. And excuse me, I've got a bit of a cold. Essentially, the report it doesn't contain any brand new like on the ground research. It's fundamentally based on the existing research and positions that have been put forward across the migration rights sector for a long time. But the idea was to present it and to put it forward in a structure that could be meaningfully adopted by a pragmatic Labour government without, while, as any of you who knows my and Another Europe's output will know, obviously it's got a very rights-based and progressive perspective on migration policy. I think it was deliberately sort of presented and put forward as something that actually doesn't need to be framed as extremely left-wing and progressive, and could be framed very much in just a differentiation for Labour, and a perspective that would be better for the country, better for migrants, better for all of us. So it was that pragmatism, that sort of practical approach, while not compromising on the rights agenda, that we were trying to get across. And I think what's interesting to get to the part of your question about why now and why this was important right now is that we're seeing more and more, and we were starting to see at the point where the report came out, but we're seeing this interesting pinch happening in terms of the anti-migrant politics that have, so dominated our political scene for years now. We're we're seeing obviously the Conservatives simply not differentiating themselves at all from the Reform Party. We're now seeing the new Restore Party and a sort of a very interesting existential discussion happening on the far right of our politics. A group that has been artificially promoted through social media algorithms and online discourse to a point of self-radicalization, also impacted by the Trump moment moment, unfortunately, it's more than a moment. But the Trump regime in the United States and its actions, I think that we're seeing this very interesting sort of debate happening on the far right of politics that is increasingly moving away from where ordinary people actually stand whatsoever. And Labour within that, having to grapple with having wedded themselves to the same right-wing anti-migrant rights position, and now rhetorically at least finding that position relatively uncomfortable. And there's this sort of push and pull of ideas going around, that are being influenced by very extreme racist positions, like we have a candidate running for election in the by-election next week who thinks that you are not British just because you hold a British passport or were born in Britain to settled parents here in the UK or whatever, and that your ethnicity or your religious background or so on can dictate whether or not you should be considered British. So we're talking about really extreme positions, but those are infiltrating a mainstream debate, and Labour has found itself caught up in a position that is frankly very uncomfortable, not only for many Labour MPs, but also for the vast majority of people who vote Labour, and those they still do exist. They live among us, people who claim to support the Labour government now, let alone obviously the huge hemorrhaging of Labour supporters towards the left. So I do think that within that context, this conversation of real alternatives that are pragmatically framed has been very well timed. And this conversation is not going to get more comfortable for Labour. So that's where we're at with the report. I do encourage folks. I think I saw that it was linked to in the chat. There's the full report, which I encourage everybody to read, obviously word by word. But there is also a summary version, and we've sort of nailed this down into 9 policy recommendations, 9 big changes that the Labour government could make today that would make a very, very big difference and move us towards a much more progressive and rights protecting immigration system.
Thanks very much, Zoe. And yeah, we'll get into some specifics in a bit. But I also encourage everyone to look at the report. I also challenge people to find something that they would disagree with. That something that is not actually extremely common sense among those recommendations. I'm going to turn to Seema now. Seema, I know that a specific focus for you in your work with JCWI, but also more broadly in your campaigning in recent years has been around how we talk about the issues we care about, what space we claim in the media environment, how we put our arguments forward. And I think an observation I have for the migration sector as a whole, I think we've done quite well in recent years to move towards weaving the narrative of migration into wider societal issues that people share and care about, things around housing and lack of good services, and thriving communities. I guess my first question to throw at you is, does that work? Do you think it's cutting through? And what more should we be doing at this point in time where the challenge feels very much existential for the groups that we're trying to advocate for, campaign with, and show solidarity for?
Thank you so much. And sorry, someone's just come into the room behind me. So yeah, firstly, I think what you've said at the end, the how this impacts the people on the front lines, who people here with insecure migration status, but also people who have family who are migrants, whose parents are migrants. It's the proposals that the Labour government has just announced, the unsettlement proposals, have had a terrifying impact. People are really panicking. People are really scared. People who've been planning to build their lives here for decades now don't know whether they can stay forever. It's what they've done is actually horrifying. And when Shabana Mahmood announced these proposals, it was on a Sunday on the Trevor Phillips show, when Trevor Phillips is an odious person. She said, we're really proudly, she said, we're going to change a generations old assumption that refuge is permanent. And if we think about what that means in the context that we're in with the rise of fascism, um, where did we get this human rights framework where refugee status was something that was dignified, something that was given to people because of their need rather than because of any contribution, and the fact that the government is now attacking the European Convention on Human Rights, is coordinating with countries across Europe to narrow the definitions of Article 8, the right to private life, and to the definition of torture, because often the conditions that people are held in detention amounts to torture, and this is how people are released as well. So what we're seeing is a full frontal attack by this Labour government to undermine the basis of the fundamental universal principles of human rights as they currently exist. So I think what Zoe is doing with this report is actually a pretty brave move, in the sense that, as Zoe, you weren't here for the discussion that we had prior, but a lot of the political consensus now is that well, not amongst everyone, but Michael and Graham were saying that the centre does not hold, and that there's, compromising with this government. We're looking at this Epstein scandal, this corruption scandal, scandal upon scandal. The government won't even listen to people now. So I think coming in and trying to find a way to influence in the broader migration environment that we're in, I'm sure it hasn't been an easy thing to do. But yeah, I think it's really needed, and definitely many of these proposals, the vast majority of them, are ones that I would agree with, and I think all of them would definitely improve the material circumstances of migrants and asylum seekers here. I think we can get into like a discussion about, certain framings and things like that. And I know I was at the report launch, and Zoe, one of the things that you said quite openly that people might disagree with is whether the points-based system for asylum seekers is one that we should use. Personally, I think it's obviously clear that the proposals you're putting in will materially improve the condition of asylum seekers. And if you're trying to lobby a government that just won't listen, if we think this is something that they might implement, then we should be trying to get them to implement that. At the same time, obviously, then for the wider framing, this idea that, people should earn something that should be a basic right is obviously problematic. And I'm sure Zoe and we're all agreed. And as we've said earlier, we are all agreed on that. So I think, yeah, it is an interesting discussion about strategy and tactics that we're having. And yeah, so I think that's like my first response, I would say, to where we are right now. And I can go further into specific things. But I guess, Zoe, you'd probably want to lead on what specific areas we're discussing.
Thanks, Seema. Yeah, I mean, it's always interesting to have kind of these sort of friendly debates. Are they even debates? I'm not sure, because we, as you say, like, we privately agree it's a question of strategy. And I guess this is something that we need to reckon with. Our strategy so far has not worked in terms of producing more positive outcomes for the communities that we're talking about, but fundamentally for turning a passive understanding and I think a support among quite a wide section of society into more vocal opposition to these most drastic and kind of heinous elements of the government's plan, but also of the general reform rhetoric. I think the people who are actually convinced by the very hateful rhetoric of the far right are are much fewer than we fear. But why is it that the rest of us are not speaking loudly enough? I guess I don't know if I can charge you with answering that question, Zoe. But you can also pick up on what Simo was saying about the differences in strategy. I guess at this point in time.
Yeah, well, I think it is a strategic conversation, really, because um, we do have to ask ourselves, and like, I guess the first thing that I would say, and that I always want to emphasize when we're talking about, why is our side on the back foot? Why are these racist narratives on the up? That the first answer is and will always be money. There is huge amounts of millionaire and billionaire wealth going into seeding and propagating the racist conversation that scapegoats migrants. That's both through the billionaire-owned media, and it's through the literal funding of, individual far-right accounts, huge bot farms, etc., to spread this propaganda. So I always push back against those who think that it's our ideas that are weaker. In fact, I think the evidence is very clear that our ideas are stronger because they remain, as you rightly said, Elena, in a more sort of like potentially unsophisticated way in terms of like the general public, but still, the general principles of humanity and anti-racism are surprisingly well entrenched within our population, and resistant to the absolute onslaught of paid for bile that is deliberately attempting to change that and to attack our solidarity with one another. So, whenever we have this conversation, I do think it's worth giving ourselves just a little bit of grace to know that, a lot of why we feel like we're losing is not because we're not doing things right. In fact, we're quite evidently doing quite a lot right. Unfortunately, we have less resource, and that's just a fact. Um, on the other side, I do think, yeah, specifically in a space like this among comrades, where the principles are not in doubt, I do think a conversation about what our strategies should be on a more granular level is really important. And I think that, yeah, we've probably not got anybody who's going to push back in this room against the sort of principle that people should have their rights protected on the basis of their basic humanity, that the right to move is fundamental, and that no person born with a particular passport, skin color, or whatever should have more right to the safety and opportunity of the UK than others. Obviously, then you can go further into that analysis and like move on from first principles and look at how the history of colonialism has shaped migration to this country and the extraction of resources from other countries, and therefore you know the economic sort of drivers, and the sort of they are here because we were there perspective. So I think with those positions firmly in agreement, I think it's worth having a conversation about audience. And I think that when digging into some of the research around what can convince people and what's effective communications in this space, there's sort of a divergent space here. And one thing is, who's your audience? So, as you mentioned, Seema, if you're talking to government ministers and you're hoping to make relatively granular policy change, you're having a different conversation to if you're talking to the masses. There's a sort of confidence that I take from knowing that essentially an emotionally principles-based position is shared by a lot of us and is very resistant, as I've said, to the propaganda of the far right against migrants. And that conversation based around rights alone is so important and must be promoted. At the same time, there is another section of society that is vulnerable to the messaging of the far right. And from some of the research that I've been reading, it is frankly, about making arguments that are based on their self-interest as well. So the question, I think, for us as progressives is how do we make arguments that take into account the need to recognize the self-interest of some of the communities we're trying to reach, while not in that sacrificing the self-interest of the groups that we are advocating on behalf of, migrants, right? So how do we make an argument that we do benefit from migration, and more importantly than that, well, that I'm giving the game away. Sorry. How do we make the argument that we benefit from migration without making the argument that that's why these people should have rights, right? Um, um, and it's very, very important to maintain that distinction. And I think that these conversations are where we hash out how to do that right. So I appreciate having them. But I think that what I've been trying to communicate and had some success with effectively reaching a lot of Labour backbenchers with is how the argument against migration is always framed as reducing numbers, getting rid of these people, making the country more white, etc. And it actually doesn't necessarily result in lower numbers at all. What it results in is a reduction in the rights of people who come. And so I think that the way that I've tried in this report and that I'm trying to do is square this circle of recognizing how self-interest can be mutual rather than opposed to one another, is by explaining that it isn't migration itself that we need. It is migrants with equal and strongly protected rights that is in the interest of the country. So making the case that these proposals to stretch out the time of precarity before migrants have a permanent status in the UK weakens their position as workers, which therefore weakens everybody's position as workers, and therefore that this is an attack on the working class rather than being an effective way to limit the number of brown people that you see on your high street, right? And that way of linking our mutual interests is very important, especially because during the sort of pinch that I've been talking about that's happening in terms of like dissecting where different parties and different political actors want to stand on the migration question, we're also seeing attacks on the left from an anti-migration perspective that's saying, oh, you just want people to be able to come here to work in care homes for you, right? And try to delegitimize left-wing positions that promote the rights of people to move on the basis that this is about bringing in people who will be a subclass of workers. And so keeping the focus, and the focus of the report is very much this, on the fact that it actually isn't good and it isn't a left-wing position to promote the entry into the country of a lot of workers on low rights. That's the Dubai-style model that we are actually moving towards under this government. And to move away from a Dubai-style model to a more European rights-based model is sort of, I think, where we can square that circle. And I'm really interested to see if others agree or want to develop that sort of thinking, because I think it is a little bit tricky.
Thanks, Zoe. And yeah, I do. I'm kind of keeping an eye also on the chat, and there are some interesting kind of discussions already emerging there around also trade unions positions and the importance of having really strong pushback from trade unions on some of these issues. I guess I want to also look at it more from a wider European lens, let's say, because obviously migration is not a process that only happens to the UK. It's a global thing. We all do it, and solutions or attempts or positive opportunities come from loads of places, but so do also deeply regressive plans. Like we could talk about European models, but obviously there's Spain and then there's Denmark. So European models are not all made equal. Seema, you are quite familiar with organizing on the French left. And I also have noticed that in the work that you do with JCWI, you've been doing a lot of campaigning that looks at detention flights and companies. I guess let's look at some of the more practical movement spaces and demands where there is a lot of energy right now. There's a lot of energy around regularizing people with irregular status, and there's lots of examples in real time happening where there are positive changes on that. For example, in Spain, do you see space for coalition building and a Europe-wide, at least, movement to make that the norm?
Thanks, Elena. And yeah, so I think this is this broader discussion about different strategies and tactics. And we know, I mean, I like to think about sometimes when you watch Game of Thrones or some of these Netflix series about ancient history and war, and there are like fortresses and people are trying to attack them. And there are a number of different ways that people win. So, like, you can ram the battering gate at the front. There are others who try and get inside and stir up trouble internally. And there are people who find breaches in the walls. And there are many different ways that we need to attack this anti-migrant politics. And I think the multitude of ways are all needed. And I think there are sometimes, as I've found, there are often tensions because obviously this is a very these topics really touch people's lives, right? And people are very passionate about this. And I think we do need to find a way in which plural strategies and tactics can work together. And I think being part of Another Europe is Possible has been a really great training space in terms of how that kind of, people with very different views, but actually on the same side, can try and get along and try and work. So I think if we look at some of the details of some of the strategies that we're trying to do at JCWI as well, but with many different partners, we have launched a campaign against the one in, one out policy. And this is a more kind of collectivism activist style campaign where we're getting people to write letters and to shame the airlines that are implementing state deportations. So Air France was implementing some of these deportations, and the demand of the campaign was that Air France stop doing it, but also publicly commit to not to do these deportations. And I think Air France definitely got the wobbles because there are no, since the campaign launched, there are no reported deportations that Air France has carried out. But they haven't publicly stated that they're not doing this because obviously that's going to bring awareness to a wide range of people who, as Zoe said, human rights and compassion is actually supported by the vast majority of people, and that will be problematic for Air France's reputation. So now the government is using charter flights to deport people. So now the campaign has shifted to targeting those airlines and their partners because those airlines are private airlines and some of them don't take customers. So boycotting them isn't necessarily the best way to implement change. But then going for their partners is a way. And this is one of the tactics that we've learned from the Palestine liberation movement, where there are lots of people who are taking direct action, who are boycotting complicit companies, who are, standing outside those companies that are complicit in horrific human rights violations and shaming them, and it's working. So I think there's a way in which the fluidity of movement tactics is really key here. And you're saying then, is there space for a pan-European wide movement? I think when you look at the movement space and where a lot of movement activity is, the way that I see it is that there's often like one flashpoint of activity where a lot of energy goes. So in my experience of movements from since 1992 when I was born, the first flashpoint was around the Iraq War and Afghanistan War. There was big movement. Then you had the Occupy movements and the anti-austerity stuff. You had the student tuition fee movements. I was a part of that. Then you had the big anti-Brexit movement. And I think now in the past few years, we've had a big pro-Palestine movement, and I do think that's where a lot of the energy has gone. And so I think with the migration movement and the actions there, a lot of those people who would have been organizing actions and protests at the time, they've now kind of they're more, involved in freeing the Filton 24 prisoners. And actually, they've won because and they've done that in coalition with other groups. So Defend Our Juries and Tim Crossland, you wouldn't um, imagine them to be natural allies. But actually, what's happened is we've got, 82-year-old priests, white women who are being arrested under the counter-terror laws in solidarity with the prisoners in the prison. So that's really how you build big coalitions. And it's interesting because now that that movement has succeeded, many of those people are coming to me and saying, hey, we're looking at what you're doing. And actually, we want to help because people are in prison right now under Britain's deportation regime. And we've been doing that work, visiting people, amplifying their voices. And actually, there are others, these strategies can be brought in. And so fighting from the outside and holding the government to account and pushing that Overton window by clearly stating our principles is really key. And it only also helps those efforts for the more pragmatic policy suggestions to the government to actually win because they'd rather come to a compromise like that than to give in to, these threatening protesters who are going to undermine the basis of the billionaire class and their profit-making schemes. So, yeah, I think these strategies definitely can work in tandem. And um, I think but the thing is, because so much energy is there with the Palestine movement, I have seen that there is less with the migration movement, and I think we need to kind of think about how we amplify multiple struggles at the same time. Because also look at Sudan, that's not getting much energy. Congo, that's not getting much energy. What's happening in Ukraine as well? Of course, like the British state and the European governments have not fully, but they've supported Ukraine quite strongly. But then when it comes to the movement perspective, how does that actually fit in, which is the kind of work that Another Europe is doing. So yeah.
Okay, so there are options and there are opportunities to build, but yeah, I absolutely share that the challenge is to be able to support multiple kind of organizing and energy for multiple issues at the same time. I'm gonna try and keep us to time this time, and I'm gonna hand over to our first question from the audience, and that is from Don, an old friend of Another Europe, and an old, long-time migrant rights campaigner. Really nice to see you, Don.
Yeah, yeah, thanks, and thanks for the discussion. Really, really fascinating. I mean, I think I probably share people's relative um, optimism about the period. I mean, I think the thing that we really ought to be aware of is the fact that people have gone through a very steep learning process over the course of the probably from 2015 onwards, when a wide spread of the population encountered exactly what the hostile environment was all about. It was about the Windrush scandal. It was about numerous other scandals which were hitting the media, and suddenly the criticisms which had long been present of the way that immigration policy operated actually made sense to a whole swathe of the population who resonated with it, and that carried over. I think another signal moment was the pandemic, when all of a sudden, whatever it was, Thursday, we were all going out and applauding key workers on our doorsteps and being realizing that so many of these key workers were migrants, and that hasn't gone away. The moods that came into existence during that period are still there. I mean, what has passed is the sense of a sharp political leadership to that. Even the Windrush crisis, we suddenly got the Parliamentary Labour Party waking up and making dramatic speeches about lay down with dogs and you wake up with fleas and whatever, very dramatic stuff. But it all vanished. It's as when Labour came into power. And I think the issue is, how do we get back to offering leadership to that group at the moment? Have we got the strategies for doing it? And those strategies take a number of directions. One of them is the one of, get down to it and do whatever is to hand, which has been the traditional approach of the migrants' rights sector. Migrants' rights generates millions of different projects, basically, whether you're dealing with refugee rights, whether you're dealing with anti-deportation, whether you're dealing with no recourse to public funds or whatever. And there's always an opportunity to found a new campaign and get new petitions off the ground and so on and so forth in order to build momentum around that. What has been absent is, something that brings that to a real direction, a fundamental criticism of the way the whole system operates, and to build a leadership around that. Zoe, the report suggests this as by emphasising the idea of what is it called, the evidence-based approach. Interesting, but we have been there before. I mean, it was actually New Labour. I remember it well when the Minister for Immigration, the MP for Hornsey and Wood Green, whose name I don't remember now, but she made a speech, a famous speech, calling for an evidence-based approach to immigration that led directly to Labour's position on the accession of the E8 European countries and a relative modernisation of the work permit scheme in order to bring in workers who need for the jobs that were there. My difficulty with it now is that was a technocratic response, typical of New Labour. And we are no longer in a technocratic period of politics. We are in a populist period of politics, and populism operates according to a very different dynamic. And I mean, to conclude here, because I could go on about this for a long time, but it does seem to me that what we really ought to be emphasising is the issue of rights, which has actually not been satisfactorily dealt with by our side of the argument up to now. In making the demand for migrants' rights, which I fully agree with, we have laid ourselves open to the notion of being woke, politically correct, and so on and so forth, snowflakes, all of this stuff. And the best critiques of the rights approach have actually ironically come from, Radia D'Souza has written the best book on the critique of rights, a left-wing human rights barrister, a book called What's Wrong with Rights? And she points out how the rights, as it's traditionally developed, is deeply implicated with neoliberal globalization policy. And we have not broken free of that. We have not been able to articulate a conception of rights which actually has its roots within the working class, how rights constitutes a possibility of solidarity. And I suppose the point that really makes me optimistic at the moment is the fact that we are seeing that happening. The most important movements are around the trade unions. For the first time that I've been able to pick it up, there is an indication that at least some elements of the trade unions actually get it. There is a commitment to organising migrant workers. There's a very active campaign, Justice for Carers, at the moment, which is bringing in thousands of people, care workers, lobbying Parliament, organising petitions and so on and so forth. And it really seems to me that the contribution that we can be making at the moment it's driven by the immediate need of the care workers. And there's a danger that it begins to look like one of these other fragmented campaigns that I mentioned before, another thing to take up, throw yourself into, see how far you get with it. But if we can commit ourselves to that at the moment, and the parliamentary lobbying and the work being done in the trade unions, and be able to generalise from beyond that point and make our rights argument indicative of how it is a working class perspective on the issue of rights, and we might be able to make more progress than we've been able to make in the past. That's it.
Thanks, Don. And thank you very much for bringing in the trade union perspective, because I also wanted to highlight the positive trends with Unison's very strong response and very strong organizing around care. But I think this also ties with what Jim was saying in the chat, because actually local authorities have commissioning powers and responsibilities around care, and actually they are quite key stakeholders in the care system. And a campaign that seeks to include councils and councillors to have a stronger voice around the threats to care workers and opportunities to expand that a system of rights. But then you're saying maybe the system of rights and how we conceptualize rights is a problem in and of itself. That's, I think, a really interesting kind of intellectual challenge still open to us. I'm gonna hand to Zoe and then to Seema to respond to that.
Thanks, Elena, and thanks, Don. I think I'd really love if you could put the name of the book you mentioned and the author in the chat, because that sounds really interesting to me. If I may, I fully agree with what's been said about the trade union movement and its importance, and the local councils. Actually, that's a really interesting sort of way of bringing power together. But I'm really, spaces like this just give us the opportunity to talk about something sometimes a little bit more intellectual. I'm really interested in this concept of like rights and how we conceptualize them within our movement. Because right now we have two parties running on the prospect that they would leave the European Convention on Human Rights. But I think it's really important that we bring in that the Reform Party is talking about leaving the European Convention on Human Rights, obviously disastrous, scrapping the Equality Act, which I'm sure I don't need to explain to the people in this room again how truly horrifying that prospect is in terms of people's rights who are marginalized and who are, in particular, economically disadvantaged for various reasons in this country. But they also, and this is something they're much less loud about, but I think it is really important that we should be loud about it, intend to leave, because the great thing about the European Convention of Human Rights is our rights framework goes way, way, way beyond that, right? And actually, in order to remove the people that they are talking about removing and acting in the way that Trump is acting now, in total defiance of any norms of international law, they would have to leave many more. And in fact, it is their intention, although less clearly stated, to leave the Refugee Convention, the Convention Against Torture, the Convention for the Elimination of Trafficking, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and so on. Because all of those instruments that are rights defending instruments protect the right not to be sent away to danger, and the right to seek asylum from persecution and so on. And you'd have to completely tear up the rights-based order that we have relied on in order to achieve their ends. So I think it's really important that we recognize that this is a full frontal assault on all of the supposedly civilized norms that we have developed over the last 80 years. And within that context, I think that essentially you're absolutely right, Don, that we have relied far, far too heavily on a conception of rights that is entirely legalistically defined. And so often the migrant rights sector has had to, or has by default, fallen back on going to court, making use of these instruments in order to protect one or another or another or another or another. And it amounts to thousands and even millions of people, but individuals at each time from the impact of the politics and the policies that are harming them. And so I think what we have absolutely failed to do is recognize that these rights structures, these legal frameworks to protect rights, were never intended to be the front line of our fight. They were a backstop to protect against the worst atrocities of human history from reoccurring. They were never intended to be how we defended our rights, how we went about defending and enacting solidarity and protecting people from harm. They are the backstop. The lawyers should be the last port of call, and they have too often been our only strategy. And that is not to undermine the very, very important impact of strategic litigation that it has been. But I think it is really, really important that we recognize as a movement now that that is the bare minimum, the backline, and that we should have been pushing much further, much faster. I think it's really evident, we've mentioned the Palestinian movement. If you look at how the exemption for Palestinian refugees was formulated under the law, it is very, very obvious that that was never intended to be a permanent exemption. It was never intended to define the rights and status of Palestinian refugees for the long term. It was a stopgap to prevent some of the worst horrors from continuing to occur, with the intention, absolutely obviously, that those rights would be expanded upon and increased through political movements well into the future, and that a better and more reasonable long-term settlement would be found for Palestinians that actually defended their rights no differently to other groups of displaced people. So I think that that is a really clear area of evidence that you can point to, that there is absolutely no way that was intended to be the long-term outcome for Palestinian, stateless Palestinians in particular. And overall, that is how we should be looking at these rights frameworks. They are under threat now, and for so long, we've just sort of tried to dig our nails in and stay still, when in fact those should have been a jumping off point, and we should have been pushing for much, much more. So yeah, thank you. I've seen that you've put that in the chat. That's just a conversation that I'm really interested with engaging with more, especially at this time of danger. And I think we're always in this position of this sort of like defensive crouch, and that has actually been our undoing in terms of actually advancing our rights.
Thank you so much, Zoe. And yeah, I'm gonna go straight to Seema, because we still have managed to be a little bit behind on time. But yet another one of these conversations that can go on, and I think should go on, because this is at the crux of how we start to win, I think. Over to you, Seema.
Thanks so much, Zoe. And that's such a really key and critical point, which is that these legal frameworks are a last resort, and they aren't the things that are going to protect our movements, and they aren't the things that are going to enable us to win. And particularly from a narrative perspective, if you're going out and talking to the public and you're talking about international law or pieces of conventions, I don't think it really hits anymore in this disruptive comms environment that we're in with the Trumps and the Farages. And I think what Zach Polanski is doing is really quite a good example of how to disrupt that supposed status quo on migration, that kind of view that, okay, everybody agrees that we have to manage it, and that, we shouldn't have, there's this distinction between legal and illegal migrants. And Zach's now coming out saying, yeah, I believe in no borders. And then to achieve it, here's a stopgap policy kind of thing, which I know, Zoe, you've been doing really amazing work behind the scenes in briefing and working on that. So yeah, I think ideology is a really key battlefield, and going out and getting a different ideology out there is important. And we've seen that the billionaire class put so much money into controlling media platforms and trying to manufacture consent for their politics of hate and racism. And I think if I go back to the day of the Brexit referendum, when I was at uni and I went to a newsagent and I looked at all the tabloid papers that were there, and The Sun and others had headlines like, "Get out before they come in," and it was just a sea of brown men's faces, or that kind of racism is something that a billionaire class is intentionally promoting and has promoted for decades. And for us to win against that narrative, we have to realize that, okay, it is long-term work, but we also need to use our platforms and our methods of communication to put our alternative vision out there. And that's to first point out what those billionaires are doing. And that's where the question of class comes in, because class is the category that unites us. So Zoe was talking about what are different people's self-interest, and class, the working class, is multiracial, and we have to unite across whatever different ethnic categories. Many of these categories, by the way, of race and ethnicity, were intentionally invented by British anthropologists and colonizers. Even the condition of blackness was something that was invented in the 16th century by slavers. And it's really interesting to actually dig in and understand where some of these kind of racial hierarchies and ideas actually came from, and actually try and deconstruct them. And I know that might seem like an intellectual fantasy task, but actually by deconstructing that, and you're showing that actually no, this is the human race with the same class interest, and the only way that we can defeat the billionaires who are robbing us all is to unite, and across the things that divide us is key. And so I think nationalism as well, and the projects of bordering themselves, they are material instruments that the billionaire class uses to stop us from actually dismantling their structures. But we know that they can do as much illegal trafficking as they like because they have no accountability, right? So they can do the horrific criminal things that they like, but we are all blocked into these bordered containers. And so I think that task of building movements across borders locally and transnationally is really key. And it's easy to sit here and talk about it, but what we need to do is start doing that work. So I did put the link to the People's Want, which is a transnational revolutionary group, which is connecting the dots between different revolutions in different places. So like Sudan, Nepal, Syria, and to see how what we can learn from that, because many of these movements are crushed by the state. And if we break the national borders, perhaps we can actually imagine and act in a way that we can prevent the crushing by the state of our transnational movements. So yeah.
Thank you, Seema. So with a rallying call for class solidarity, I think is a very apt way to conclude this second part of our sessions for members. Many thanks for both Seema and Zoe for joining us, especially Zoe, as you're not feeling great today, and I hope you go and have a rest and feel amazing as soon as possible. Right, so we come to the end of the open public access space of the AGM. I am not in a position or of the inclination to police who stays behind and takes part in the strategic discussion. If you're a member, I hope you know you're a member. If you want to take part in the strategic discussion and then later on you find out that you're not a member, I'm going to post a link for you to easily join and become a member of Another Europe is Possible. But this last part, I am going to hand over to Luke Cooper. I've also posted a link on our website. You can find the activities report for 2025, which is quite extensive, actually, and our strategy for 2026 as well, which we're now going to discuss.
Thanks, Elena. I think I'm chairing this discussion, right?
Yes, you are.
So Elena, like as you've written such a great activities report, maybe you could just spend a few minutes like speaking to it, and then we can like gather our thoughts and think about the what we want to do in the period ahead. Elena has put a link to that report in the chat. It's been a really busy year again for Another Europe, which is fantastic. And I think maybe one thing we can reflect on in the next half an hour or so that we've got to come, how we mark our 10-year anniversary this year. So Elena, let's go to you to back to you to just speak to the activities report, and then we'll have a chat.
I'm going to try and do a whistle stop tour of this report. As you may have noticed, we have had a bit of a rebrand for Another Europe is Possible, and that is not just cosmetic changes around colors and nicer graphics. We want a much more coherent narrative around the three strands that we work on. That's solidarity beyond borders, real democracy now, and transforming Europe from below. Those are the key pillars of our work. And I'm really pleased to report that the vast majority of activity that we have put out last year has been coalition building and coalition work. We were key and continue to be a key partner in the Stop Trump coalition, and this was obviously an incredibly busy year for the Stop Trump alliance of organizations. We organized protests for Trump's visit, but potentially more significantly, we massively ramped up our media presence to respond to the political crises that Trump symbolizes. We've also worked with hundreds of humanitarian organizations to call for humanitarian campaign for the detained prisoners, civilians by the Russian state, and Ukrainian and Russian prisoners of war, together with the People First campaign. We worked on an arms embargo for Israel, together with If Not Now and the Refuser Network. We continue our work with Ukraine Solidarity Campaign and Ukraine Solidarity Campaign in Scotland. This year, a big focus was on some of the dual criminals of both climate change and funding Russia's war that hide among respectable, so-called respectable businesses here in the UK. So we did a lot of work in Scotland on that. Migrant solidarity, a huge area of our work, not just the report, but also multiple actions calling out harmful rhetoric that was coming from Keir Starmer this year. Island of Strangers apparently is acceptable political speak now, not on our watch, as they say. We pushed hard against that. On the democracy from below front, we continued working with Citizens Take Over Europe, and Dave on our national committee represents us at this forum, looking at what real participatory democracy would look like in the European context. We were part of the Make Them Pay Alliance. We were visible on the streets, calling out polluters, calling out tax evading corporations. We took part in the Make Votes Matter weekend of action, because fixing our broken democratic system is key to us achieving what we want to do. We kept the flag of Rejoin going. We did a number of online events and published resources, continued with and actually launched a very exciting new project. Our podcast now combines video and audio and is done in collaboration with Stop Trump and Global Justice Now. And yes, we managed to fit in a rebrand within all of that. And on a sad note, we have said goodbye to SEMA this year. SEMA has been part of the Another Europe family for a really long time. As an